In February 2021, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission's Striped Bass Management Board approved for public comment the public information document for Amendment 7 to the Interstate Fishery Management Plan for Atlantic striped bass. As the first step in the amendment process, the public information document, or PID, seeks input from the public on the future management of the Atlantic striped bass fishery. In this presentation, we will cover background information and the development process for Amendment 7. We will provide an overview of the issues included in the PID, as well as provide information on how to submit public comments. The last plan amendment to the Atlantic Striped Bass Fishery Management Plan was adopted in 2003, which was Amendment 6. Since then, the status and understanding of the striped bass stock and fishery has changed considerably, which has raised concern that the current management program no longer reflects current fishery needs and priorities. And so, in August 2020, the Striped Bass Management Board initiated the development of Amendment 7 to the Interstate Fishery Management Plan for Atlantic striped bass. The PID is the first step of the Commission's formal amendment process. The PID is a broad scoping document that announces the Commission's intent to gather information on striped bass management. It provides an opportunity for the public to identify and provide input on major issues, and it asks the public how they would like to see the fishery managed. Public comments on the PID will be considered by the Striped Bass Management Board when developing the first draft of Amendment 7, which is the next step in the amendment process. The draft amendment will be a more specific document that details specific management options to address the issues moving forward. This slide shows a timeline for the development of Amendment 7, which is subject to change per the direction of the Striped Bass Management Board. In August 2020, the Board initiated the development of Amendment 7, and in February 2021, the Board approved the PID for public comment. We are currently in the public comment period for the PID, which is open through April 9, 2021. In May 2021, the Board will review public comments received on the PID and may direct the plan development team to begin developing the draft amendment. In October 2021, the Board could consider approving the draft amendment for public comment. After the public comment period on the draft amendment, the Board could select final measures and consider the amendment for approval in early 2022. The PID includes the following components: a broad overview of the issues that the Board has identified for consideration in the amendment, background information on the Atlantic striped bass population, fisheries, and management, as well as a series of questions for the public to consider about the management of the species. Overall, the Commission is seeking public comment on the question, how would you like management of the Atlantic striped bass fishery to look in the future? The PID provides information on the following issues that were identified by the Striped Bass Management Board. Issue 1 is fishery goals and objectives. Issue 2 is biological reference points. Issue 3 is management triggers. Issue 4 is stock rebuilding targets and schedule. Issue 5 is regional management. Issue 6 is management program equivalency, referred to as conservation equivalency. Issue 7 is recreational release mortality. Issue 8 is recreational accountability. Issue 9 is coastal commercial allocation. And finally, Issue 10 includes any other issues identified through public comments concerning the management of striped bass. The next slides will provide a brief overview of each of the 10 issues included in the PID. Issue 1 is fishery goals and objectives. The current goal and objectives of the Atlantic Striped Bass Fishery Management Plan were established in 2003 in Amendment 6 and are listed in the PID. As mentioned earlier, there is concern that the current goals and objectives no longer reflect current fishery needs and priorities. The Striped Bass Management Board has identified 3 guiding themes for future striped bass management, which are management stability, flexibility, and regulatory consistency. Public comment questions for consideration on Issue 1 are the existing goal and objectives of Amendment 6 still in line with current fishery needs and priorities? Which specific priorities, if any, are missing from the existing goal or objectives? Which of the existing objectives, if any, should be removed or refined? Do the existing objectives balance the need for management stability, flexibility, and regulatory consistency? And which of these three themes do you value most? Issue 2 is biological reference points. The current biological reference points for striped bass are coast-wide and were established in 2003 through Amendment 6. Female spawning stock biomass, or SSB, and the fishing mortality rate, or F, are estimated and compared to target and threshold levels, which are the biological reference points, in order to assess the status of the stock. Female spawning stock biomass is used as a measure of the ability of the stock to replenish itself. The table here shows the current reference points for striped bass based on the results of the 2018 benchmark stock assessment. The 1995 estimate of female spawning stock biomass is used as the spawning stock biomass threshold because many stock characteristics were reached by this year, and this is also the year the stock was declared recovered. The spawning stock biomass target is set at 125% of that threshold. The fishing mortality target and threshold are the values of fishing mortality estimated to achieve those respective spawning stock biomass target and threshold over the long term. The Commission's understanding of stock performance has changed over time, as shown in the figure here. This figure shows the female spawning stock biomass estimates, which are the solid lines, and resulting spawning stock biomass targets, which are the dashed lines, and thresholds, which are the dotted lines, from the last 4 benchmark stock assessments for striped bass. The definitions of the spawning stock biomass target and threshold have not changed since 2003, but the estimated spawning stock biomass time series values have changed with each new stock assessment. All assessments show a similar trend over time, with the population reaching all-time high levels during the early 2000s. However, the 2007 benchmark stock assessment, which is the blue line, and the 2013 benchmark stock assessment, which is the yellow line, indicated that female spawning stock biomass was above the target during this time, while the 2018 benchmark stock assessment, which is the black line, indicated that the spawning stock biomass target has not been reached at any point during the time series shown here. It is worth noting that the 2018 benchmark assessment also indicates that fishing mortality has consistently exceeded the fishing mortality target since 1996. The changes in the time series are often more pronounced in a benchmark stock assessment, with new or improved data and advancements in population modeling that are incorporated. For example, the 2018 benchmark stock assessment included newly calibrated estimates of recreational harvest and also included multiple updates to the stock assessment model. Other empirical-based reference points could be considered for striped bass, such as using the estimate of spawning stock biomass for a year other than 1995. Other potential alternatives to the current reference points are restricted by data and modeling limitations. However, model-based reference points, such as spawning potential ratio, may be available in the future. Additionally, a 2-stock statistical catch-at-age assessment model is under development, which has the potential to produce separate sets of reference points for the Chesapeake Bay stock and for the ocean region, which includes the Delaware Bay Hudson River stock complex. Public comment questions for consideration on Issue 2 are: is the 1995 estimate of female spawning stock biomass still an appropriate benchmark for determining stock status? Is there a better empirical reference year or other empirical approach that should be considered? Is a 25% buffer appropriate for the spawning stock biomass target? Should the board prioritize development of model-based reference points and/or stock-specific reference points? What stock characteristics should the biological reference points attempt to achieve? Issue 3, Management Triggers, and Issue 4, Stock Rebuilding Target and Schedule, are addressed together in the PID, since the stock rebuilding schedule is essentially a result of the triggers. These issues are also inherently linked to Issue 2, Biological Reference Points, which was just discussed. Currently, there are a series of management triggers in place to prevent overfishing of the striped bass resource. The triggers are based on the biological reference points and juvenile abundance indices. One concern is that triggers require action on different timelines. Fishing mortality-based triggers require quick corrective action within 1 year. Spawning stock biomass-based triggers allow up to 10 years for stock rebuilding, recognizing the biology of striped bass, that they are long-lived and late to mature. If the juvenile abundance index shows recruitment failure for 3 consecutive years, the board then determines an appropriate management action. Shortfalls have emerged with how the management triggers are designed. When spawning stock biomass is below the target level, the variable nature of fishing mortality can result in a continued need for management action. Additionally, the shorter timetables for corrective action are in conflict with the desire for management stability. The board is sometimes criticized for considering changes to the management program before the stock has a chance to respond to the last set of management changes. And finally, long periods of below average recruitment, which have contributed to recent declines in biomass, has raised questions about whether the recruitment-based trigger is designed appropriately. Public comment questions for consideration on issues 3 and 4 are: which management triggers, if any, should be revisited? What is an appropriate timeframe to respond to overfishing or overfish determinations? Should the F-based triggers account for annual variability in fishing mortality? What is more important, rebuilding the stock quickly or mitigating impacts to fisheries? In other words, do you prefer significant changes to rebuild the stock quickly or smaller incremental changes over time to gradually rebuild the stock? Issue 5 is regional management. The Atlantic striped bass population is assessed and managed on a coastwide basis. However, the population is actually comprised of several stocks, and striped bass fisheries operate very differently along the coast due to the size and availability of fish in those areas and other cultural differences. Amendment 5 and Amendment 6 address this by managing the Chesapeake Bay and Albemarle Sound Roanoke River regions under different fishing mortality rates, until Addendum 4 to Amendment 6 was implemented in 2015. Under Addendum 4, the entire striped bass population is once again managed under the same fishing mortality rate. As previously mentioned, a 2-stock assessment model is currently under development, which has the potential to develop separate reference points for the Chesapeake Bay stock and the ocean region. The ocean region includes the Delaware Bay Hudson River stock complex. There are stock assessment tools available now that the board could use to pursue a different management program for the Chesapeake Bay and ocean regions. The current single stock assessment model does separate fishery removals into an ocean fleet and a Chesapeake Bay fleet, and these 2 fleet components can be used to explore different management programs for the 2 regions. In this scenario, the fishing mortality target and threshold would be set for the entire coastwide stock, and the Chesapeake Bay region and the ocean region would then be allocated a proportion of the overall fishing mortality. The board would have to make this decision about how to allocate the fishing mortality between the 2 regions. Public comment questions for consideration on Issue 5 are: should separate regional management programs be pursued for the Chesapeake Bay and the ocean region, which includes the Delaware Bay Hudson River stock complex? If so, how should the board determine the appropriate allocation of fishing mortality between the 2 regions? Should the board consider any other areas, such as the Delaware River or Hudson River, for separate regional management programs? And if so, what level of data should support additional regional separation? Should development of similar assessment tools be prioritized to support regional management programs for other areas of the coast? Issue 6 is management program equivalency, referred to as conservation equivalency. Conservation equivalency has been included in the striped bass management program since the stock was declared rebuilt in 1995. The striped bass fishery management plan uses conservation equivalency to provide states with flexibility to develop alternative regulations that achieve the same quantified level of conservation as the fishery management plan standards. To implement conservation equivalency, states must develop a proposal demonstrating how the proposed regulations are equivalent to the fishery management plan standards. All proposals are subject to technical review and board approval before the state can implement a conservation equivalency program. They are also subject to a review of effectiveness following implementation. The process of conservation equivalency is detailed in the Commission's Conservation Equivalency Policy and Technical Guidance document. Both conservation equivalency programs and coastwide measures have variable levels of effectiveness, and a conservation equivalency program may provide a higher level of conservation than the coastwide measure in a state. However, it is difficult to determine if a coastwide measure or a conservation equivalency program has performed better or worse due to the challenge of separating the performance from outside variables. There is perceived value in allowing for this flexibility through conservation equivalency, but as just mentioned, there are some concerns and challenges. These challenges include the fundamental conflict between allowing flexibility through conservation equivalency and achieving regulatory consistency among the states, particularly between neighboring states with shared water bodies. And as mentioned in the previous slide, it is challenging to evaluate the effectiveness or success of conservation equivalency programs because of the difficulty in separating the effects of the conservation equivalency program from other factors like angler behavior and availability of fish. Another challenge is that conservation equivalency proposals for the recreational fishery generally rely on state-level catch and effort data estimated by the Marine Recreational Information Program, or MRIP. These state-level MRIP data are less precise than regional or coastwide estimates. Finally, there is limited guidance on how and when conservation equivalency should be pursued and how equivalency is defined. Public comment questions for consideration on issue 6 include: should conservation equivalency be part of the striped bass fishery management plan? Should the board restrict the use of conservation equivalency based on stock status, data restrictions, differences from neighboring states, and any other potential issues? Should the board provide a strict definition for equivalency? Should more quantitatively rigorous and clearly defined data requirements be required as a prerequisite for conservation equivalency proposals to be considered? Should there be limitations on how many conservation equivalency proposals a state can submit? Additional public comment questions for issue 6 are: should conservation equivalency be limited to time and areas with unique ecological characteristics? Given state-level MRIP estimates are often less precise than regional or coastwide estimates, are these data used appropriately to develop conservation equivalency proposals? Given the variability in recreational catch and harvest from year to year, how do you evaluate effectiveness of conservation equivalency programs following implementation? Issue 7 is recreational release mortality. Since 1990, roughly 90% of all striped bass caught recreationally were released alive, either due to cultural preferences or to regulation. The figure here shows the total recreational catch, the blue bars, and the proportion of catch released alive, which is the red line. The stock assessment currently uses a 9% recreational release mortality rate. This estimate assumes that coastwide, 9% of all striped bass caught and released alive will die. Recreational release mortality constitutes a large component of annual fishing mortality because the striped bass fishery is predominantly recreational and most of the catch is released alive. The current management program primarily uses bag limits and size limits to control harvest, but these are not designed to control the number of fish that are caught and released. In order to reduce recreational release mortality in the fishery, managers could consider additional gear restrictions to help increase the chance of survival after being released, or additional effort controls to reduce the number of trips interacting with striped bass, and thus reduce the overall number of striped bass released alive. Some stakeholders value the ability to harvest striped bass, while other stakeholders value the experience of fishing for striped bass, regardless of whether they are able to retain the fish. Public comment questions for consideration on issue 7 are: should management focus on reducing the rate at which fish die after being released alive through additional gear restrictions similar to recent actions regarding the use of circle hooks? Should management focus on reducing effort in the fishery in order to reduce the total number of striped bass caught and released? Should management consider seasonal closures when environmental conditions are unfavorable to striped bass survival when released? And what are some ways to improve awareness and stewardship of the resource? Issue 8 is recreational accountability. The recreational striped bass fishery is not managed by a quota system, for example, like a recreational harvest limit, or RHL, that is used in other recreational fisheries. The striped bass fishery is managed with size limits and bag limits, as well as seasons in some states. As a result of this management approach, recreational removals fluctuate from year to year with changes in angler effort and changes in the size, age structure, and distribution of the striped bass population. This makes it difficult to evaluate whether removals from the sector are too high and makes it difficult to implement accountability measures. The use of quota systems like RHLs can be an effective way to implement accountability. However, they can also lead to frequent annual regulatory changes. Public comment questions for consideration on issue 8 are: should the board consider implementing an RHL for recreational striped bass management? How should an RHL overage or underage be addressed? Should stock status be considered when handling an RHL overage or underage? Are there additional accountability measures the board should consider for managing the recreational striped bass fishery? Issue 9 is coastal commercial quota allocation. The striped bass commercial quota is based on harvest data from 1972 through 1979, which may or may not be an appropriate baseline. There is concern about data quality during that time, and no other commission-managed species is managed with harvest data as old as this time period. Additionally, the coastal commercial quota is not set annually based on changes in available biomass, but rather state-specific quotas are fixed in terms of pounds of fish until an assessment indicates removals need to be adjusted. This is different from other species where the quota is set every year or every few years in response to changes in biomass. Public comment questions for consideration on issue 9 are: should this amendment address commercial allocation or be considered in a future management action? Is the 1972 through 1979 landings period still an appropriate baseline for the coastal commercial allocation? Should other allocation approaches be considered? Should the coastwide quota be explicitly set on an annual basis or following an updated stock assessment or benchmark? Should regions with the necessary data be able to use a harvest control rule where commercial quotas are set annually based on exploitable biomass? Issue 10 is intended to include any other issues raised by the public concerning striped bass management. Again, the overall question to the public is: how would you like management of the striped bass fishery to look in the future? Examples of other issues may include impacts due to climate change, such as changes in sea surface temperature, shifting population distributions, and other impacts. Impacts from habitat degradation, including runoff and poor water quality, degradation of nursery areas, and other impacts. Limited resources for law enforcement, as well as other research priorities. When providing comment on other management issues, it is important to indicate what actions managers can take to address these issues. The next slides provide information on how to submit public comment on the PID. The PID for Atlantic Striped Bass Amendment 7 is posted online at www.asmfc.org/about-us/public-input. The Commission has scheduled 11 public hearings to gather public input on the PID for Amendment 7. This table provides the dates and times of the 11 public hearings, which will occur virtually via webinar. For more information on attending a public hearing and how to register for the hearing webinar, visit www.asmfc.org/calendar, or you can contact Emily Franca, the FMP coordinator, at the email listed on this slide. You can submit written comments on the PID for Amendment 7 via email by sending them to comments@asmfc.org using the subject line Striped Bass PID. You can send comments via mail to the following address: 1050 North Highland Street, Suite 200 A through N, Arlington, Virginia 22201. Or you can send comments via fax to 703-842-0741.